Somewhere in a locked, climate-controlled warehouse right now, there are barrels of a golden liquid worth so much that governments have built strategic reserves for it, guarded like oil, and criminals have gone to prison for stealing it. It is not gold. It is not crude. It is tree sap. One province controls the overwhelming majority of the world's supply of it, and it can take an almost absurd volume of raw sap boiled down for hours just to produce a single gallon of the finished product sitting in your kitchen cabinet. Think about that for a second. That bottle, shaped like a tiny log cabin, the one you drizzle on pancakes without a second thought, is the endpoint of one of the strangest supply chains in the history of food. It survived war. It survived slavery-era boycotts. It survived fraud so widespread that governments had to step in and legislate what could legally be called syrup. And it began, long before any of that, as something closer to a sacrament than a sweetener, a substance so tightly bound to ritual and seasonal knowledge that entire nations organized their calendars around it. So how did the sap of a single tree species, tapped for a few precious weeks each year, become a guarded secret, then a battleground, then a global commodity controlled by strategic reserves and cartel-like enforcement? How did something so simple, water pulled from frozen ground into a trunk and concentrated by fire, end up entangled with abolitionists, wartime rationing boards, con artists selling fake syrup by the truckload, and a heist so brazen it earned international headlines? We are about to trace that path from the sacred sugarbush of indigenous nations to the industrial evaporators of the modern era, and by the end you will never look at that bottle on your table the same way again. This is the strange, sticky, surprisingly high-stakes history of maple syrup. Long before there were bottles, there were villages that moved. Every year, as the deep freeze of late winter began to loosen its grip, and the days warmed just enough for the nights to still bite hard, entire communities among the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples packed up and relocated to their sugarbush, the stands of maple trees their families had returned to for generations. This was not a casual errand. It was a season with its own name, its own rituals, and its own place in the calendar of the year, sitting alongside planting, hunting, and harvest as one of the pillars around which life was organized. In many Anishinaabe communities this time was called Iskigamizige Gizis, the sugar-making moon, and it marked not just a change in weather, but a spiritual threshold, the moment the world tipped from scarcity toward abundance. Families held ceremonies before the first tap was ever cut into bark, offering tobacco and prayers of thanks to the trees for what they were about to give. The sap itself was treated as a gift rather than a resource, something owed respect precisely because it could not be commanded, only requested and received with gratitude. Haudenosaunee tradition carries a similar reverence, with maple regarded as a foundational plant in their Thanksgiving address, one of the first to offer sustenance after the hardship of winter, and its arrival celebrated as evidence that the earth had not forgotten its people. The knowledge of exactly when to tap, how deep to cut, which trees produced the sweetest run, and how long a single tree could be harvested without damage was not written down anywhere. It lived in the hands and memories of specific families and clans, passed from elders to children through direct instruction during the sugarbush season itself, refined over what researchers now believe was centuries, possibly longer, of accumulated observation. This was intellectual property in every meaningful sense, just encoded in oral tradition and lived practice rather than patents. And the technology behind it, contrary to the image of primitive people fumbling toward a discovery, was in fact a carefully engineered multi-stage process. Trees were tapped using tools crafted for the purpose. Sap was collected in vessels made of birch bark, folded and stitched into containers, and the liquid was then reduced, not by industrial fire, but through techniques including dropping fire-heated stones directly into bark vessels to boil the sap down, a method requiring precise control of heat and timing to avoid destroying the container that held it. The result, concentrated sugar and syrup, was used not only as food, but as a form of currency and gift exchange between nations, cementing trade relationships and diplomatic bonds. It was medicine, seasoning, and celebration all at once. To reduce this to a footnote before European arrival, as so much popular history does, is to erase a sophisticated and spiritually rich tradition that existed on its own terms for a very long time, before anyone with a musket ever saw a bucket of sap. Now here is where popular history likes to take over, and where it gets almost everything wrong. There is a folk legend, retold in countless children's books and tourist pamphlets, that maple syrup was discovered entirely by accident. In the most common version, a chief's wife, needing water to boil venison for her husband's dinner, unknowingly draws liquid from a container that had been collecting sap dripping from a hatchet wound in a nearby maple. She boils the meat in this sap-tainted water, not realizing her mistake, and the family sits down to a meal that tastes unexpectedly, impossibly sweet. Astonished, they trace the flavor back to the tree, and maple sugaring is born in a single lucky evening of culinary confusion. It is a charming story. It is also almost certainly false. And worse, it is a story that quietly does a lot of ideological work, because it recasts a sophisticated indigenous technology as a happy accident stumbled into by an unnamed, faceless woman, stripping out generations of deliberate engineering and replacing them with dumb luck. Think about what that framing implies for a second. It suggests native peoples possessed a valuable resource for centuries without understanding what they had, until chance corrected the oversight. The archaeological and anthropological record tells a very different story. Sugaring camps recovered by researchers show organized seasonal settlements, not one-off accidents, with specialized tools including grooved spiles designed specifically to direct sap flow into collection vessels, an innovation requiring understanding of tree biology that has nothing to do with a hatchet gash and everything to do with generations of careful experimentation. The stone boiling method described in the previous section, dropping heated rocks into bark containers, was not a crude workaround, but a refined technique requiring exact knowledge of thermal thresholds, since too much heat too fast would scorch the sap or destroy the birch bark vessel entirely. That is not luck. That is applied physics, transmitted through oral instruction across generations. Anthropologists studying pre-contact sugarbush sites have also found evidence of long-term, repeated use of the same maple groves season after season, meaning specific trees were identified, remembered, and returned to year after year, a level of forest management incompatible with a single chance discovery narrative. And frankly, the timeline does not hold up either. Evidence of maple sugaring predates any recorded contact with Europeans by a significant margin, meaning the entire tradition, the ceremonies, the tools, the seasonal calendar built around the sugar-making moon, was already mature and established long before any hatchet and hindsight folktale could have taken root. The legend persists not because it is accurate, but because it is convenient. It turns a complex indigenous science into a cute campfire story. And in doing so, it lets everyone off the hook for asking harder questions about who actually built this knowledge and who would later profit from taking it. So who did profit? The first Europeans to encounter maple sugaring did not invent anything. They watched, they learned, and then, in the pattern that would repeat across the continent for the next 4 centuries, they wrote themselves into the center of the story. French Jesuit missionaries traveling among indigenous communities in the 17th century left behind some of the earliest written European accounts of sugar camps, describing the tapping, the boiling, the granulated sugar produced at the end of the process, all of it already fully formed by the time any European pen touched paper to record it. These missionaries were not neutral observers. They were guests, often uneasy ones, inside a system of knowledge they did not build and only partially understood, and their journals read less like discovery and more like transcription. Fur traders followed close behind, and where fur traders went, commerce went with them. Maple sugar, once a food tied to ceremony, to the sugar-making moon, to kinship obligations about who received the first taste of the season's syrup, started to become something else entirely, a tradable good. Colonists quickly noticed that maple sugar solved a very practical problem. Cane sugar had to be imported from distant Caribbean plantations. It was expensive, and supply could be unreliable depending on weather, war, or which European empire currently controlled the shipping lanes. Maple sugar, by contrast, was local, seasonal, and did not require a single ship to cross the Atlantic. Settlers who set up farms near indigenous sugarbush territory began adopting, and frequently outright appropriating, the tapping and boiling techniques with little acknowledgement of where the knowledge originated. Within a few generations, colonial farm almanacs and household guides were describing maple sugaring as though it was simply a feature of the land itself, something anyone with an axe and a kettle could figure out, rather than a sophisticated, inherited technology. This is the quiet mechanism by which appropriation works. It does not always look like theft. Sometimes it looks like a farmer's wife in a homestead diary, casually noting that she boiled sap today, with no sense that the today she casually references sits atop centuries of accumulated indigenous ecological science. By the 18th century, maple sugar had firmly entered the colonial economy, traded at general stores, bartered between neighbors, and folded into household production alongside candle-making and weaving. The tools began to shift too, wooden buckets replacing bark containers, iron kettles replacing stone boiling, but the fundamental process, tap the tree, collect the sap, boil away the water, remained exactly what it had always been. What changed was who controlled it, who profited from it, and who got credited for it. And that shift, from sacred seasonal practice to household commodity, was only the beginning. Because once something becomes a commodity, the next question is never how do we honor it, it is how do we scale it. How do you scale a ritual? For the better part of 2 centuries, the answer was slowly and with an enormous amount of human labor. A single sugarbush operation in the early industrial era still meant one family, dozens or hundreds of trees, and a punishing 6-week window each spring where every able-bodied person on the farm dropped whatever else they were doing. Buckets had to be hung on individual spiles, checked, emptied, and rehung, sometimes twice a day, in mud season, in the cold, in terrain no vehicle could easily reach. Sap had to be hauled by hand or by horse-drawn sledge to a boiling station, where it was reduced over an open fire in flat iron pans, a process that could take the better part of a day to turn a few dozen gallons of sap into a single gallon of syrup. The ratio itself tells you why this was such a brutal bottleneck. It takes roughly 40 gallons of raw sap, sometimes more, to produce just 1 gallon of finished syrup. Multiply that by a farm trying to feed itself, and you understand why maple sugaring remained a small-scale, family-scale enterprise for so long. Then came the evaporator. The flat pan gave way to specially designed evaporator arches in the 19th century, shallow, segmented metal pans that dramatically increased the surface area exposed to heat, allowing sap to boil down far faster and with far more control over the final product. This was not a subtle upgrade. It was the difference between a household craft and an industry. Producers who adopted evaporator technology could process vastly more sap in a single day than their grandparents could have managed in a week, and syrup quality became more consistent, more replicable, more sellable at scale. The spile changed too. Wooden taps, prone to rot, splitting and bacterial contamination, were gradually replaced by metal spiles, which lasted longer, drained more efficiently, and could be manufactured uniformly rather than whittled by hand one at a time. Suddenly a sugarbush was not just a stand of trees with holes drilled into them. It was infrastructure. But the single biggest transformation, the one that finally severed maple sugaring from its bucket and sledge past entirely, was plastic tubing. In the 20th century, producers began running networks of tubing directly from tap to sugar house, sometimes threading through thousands of trees across a hillside, using gravity and eventually vacuum pressure to pull sap continuously downhill without a single bucket, without a single sledge trip, without a single worker trudging tree to tree in the snow. Vacuum systems could pull more sap out of a tree than gravity alone ever could, increasing yield per tap while simultaneously slashing the labor required to collect it. Think about that for a second. An activity that had required an army of hands for hundreds of years had been reduced, tree by tree, to a network of tubes and a pump. This is the quiet engine behind every plastic jug of syrup sold in a supermarket today. Not romance. Infrastructure, and infrastructure once built, demands a market large enough to justify it, which is exactly the pressure that would soon pull maple sugar into far bigger and far uglier fights than anyone tapping a tree could have imagined. Because sugar has never just been sugar. It has always been politics wearing a sweet disguise, and maple sugar was about to get dragged into a fight far larger than any sugarbush. Cane sugar, the dominant sweetener in colonial and early republic kitchens, came from Caribbean and southern plantations built on enslaved labor. Every spoonful stirred into tea carried that weight, whether the person stirring it acknowledged it or not. A growing movement of abolitionists in the 18th and 19th centuries began arguing that consumers could not claim clean hands while consuming a product soaked in bondage, and they looked northward for an alternative that required no chains to produce. Maple sugar, tapped from trees on free soil by free hands, became more than a pantry staple. It became a statement. Boycotting cane sugar and switching to maple was pitched as an act of conscience you could perform 3 times a day, quietly at your own table, without ever marching or petitioning. Pamphlets and preachers alike praised maple sugar as the moral sweetener, the one untouched by the whip. Whether most households actually made the switch permanently is another matter entirely, but the symbolism stuck, and maple sugar picked up a reputation it had never asked for. The sweetener of the free conscience, sold at a premium to those willing to pay for a clear one. That reputation gave northern maple producers a market angle cane sugar simply could not compete on, no matter how cheap Caribbean imports got. But moral marketing only goes so far when supply chains are disrupted by actual conflict. Wars, blockades, and import disruptions repeatedly squeezed the flow of cane sugar into American and Canadian markets, and each time, maple sugar stepped into the gap as the dependable domestic backup, the sweetener you could always get, because it grew in your own backwoods rather than an ocean away. That reliability turned maple sugar from a moral talking point into a practical hedge, the sweetener of last resort that somehow kept becoming the sweetener of first resort whenever global trade wobbled. And then, just as maple sugar had carved out its identity as the ethical, dependable, homegrown alternative, industry handed the market something maple sugar could never outmarket: sheer cheapness. Refined cane sugar production scaled up dramatically through the 19th century, driving prices down far below what any hand-tapped, wood-fired maple operation could match gallon for gallon, or pound for pound. Beet sugar entered the field too, grown in temperate climates without any need for a tropical plantation at all, further undercutting the price floor. Suddenly, the moral premium that had sustained maple sugar's reputation ran headlong into an economic wall. Consumers who might have nodded solemnly at the ethics of maple sugar in one decade were, in the next, reaching for the cheaper bag on the shelf without a second thought. Maple sugar did not disappear, but it was pushed decisively out of its role as an everyday household sweetener and into something closer to a specialty product, a syrup for pancakes rather than a sugar for the sugar bowl. The moral high ground, it turned out, was no match for a lower price tag. That demotion from staple to specialty is precisely what set the stage for the next transformation. Because a product no longer needed for daily survival, but prized instead for flavor and authenticity, becomes a product worth faking. If a product survives by reputation rather than necessity, that reputation becomes the single most valuable thing about it, and valuable things attract people willing to fake them. This is the quiet engine behind one of the least glamorous chapters in the maple story, the era of adulteration, when maple syrup on a label meant almost nothing at all. Once maple syrup became a premium good rather than a kitchen staple, it stopped competing on price and started competing on authenticity. And authenticity, it turns out, is remarkably easy to counterfeit. Unscrupulous bottlers discovered that cane sugar syrup, corn syrup, and cheap flavoring agents could be blended together, tinted to the right amber hue, and poured into bottles bearing maple leaves and rustic sugar house imagery, sold at a fraction of the cost of the real thing while charging nearly the same price. Some blends contained a trace of actual maple syrup, just enough to allow a technically defensible label. Others contained none at all. The consumer, pouring what they believed was liquid tapped from a Vermont sugarbush, was in many cases pouring flavored corn syrup manufactured in a factory nowhere near a maple tree. For decades, this went largely unchecked, because there was no reliable way for a buyer, or even a regulator, to tell the difference just by looking. The fraud was not a fringe activity. It was, for a time, close to standard practice in parts of the industry, an open secret among distributors, even as it remained invisible to the public. What finally forced the issue were not activists or lawmakers acting on principle, but chemists and agricultural officials who began developing analytical methods to detect adulteration scientifically, testing for sugar composition and mineral content that could distinguish genuine maple sap sugars from cane and corn substitutes. These early food scientists functioned as de facto whistleblowers, publishing findings that embarrassed an industry built partly on the assumption that nobody was checking. Their work forced a reckoning. If the market could not police itself, and it demonstrably could not, then government would have to step in and define, with some scientific rigor, what could and could not legally be called maple syrup. That effort produced grading systems, official classifications based on color, density, and flavor profile, intended to give both purity and quality a standardized, verifiable meaning, rather than leaving it to whatever a bottler's marketing department felt like printing on the label. Regulatory bodies were tasked with enforcement, inspecting production and testing composition, turning what had been a folk product, regulated only by trust, into one regulated by statute and laboratory analysis. It is a strange arc to sit with for a moment, a product born from sacred ritual, appropriated into colonial commerce, industrialized by evaporators and tubing, and now finally required to prove its own authenticity under scientific scrutiny before it could legally sit on a store shelf. The wood smoke and boiling kettles of the sugarbush had given way to test tubes and grading charts, but standardizing what maple syrup legally was turned out to be only half the battle, because once purity could be verified and enforced, the next question became, who would control how much of the verified, authentic product reached the world at all? And the answer to that question would eventually concentrate in the hands of a single Canadian province, willing to guard its liquid gold with an intensity that would make even OPE take notice. Quebec produces roughly 70% of the entire world's maple syrup, a concentration of agricultural power so lopsided that no other food commodity on earth is dominated so thoroughly by a single political jurisdiction. Coffee is grown across dozens of nations. Wine comes from every temperate continent. Maple syrup, for all practical purposes, comes from Quebec, and Quebec intends to keep it that way. The province did not stumble into this dominance by accident of climate alone, though the sugar maple's narrow band of ideal habitat certainly helped. It engineered dominance through organization, the same way OPEC engineered dominance over oil, by controlling supply, controlling price, and punishing anyone who tried to undercut the system from the outside. The instrument of that control is a federation of producers that functions less like a farmers' cooperative and more like a cartel, setting production quotas for tens of thousands of member sugarbushes, and maintaining something the industry itself calls the strategic reserve, a network of warehouses holding tens of millions of pounds of syrup in reserve, released deliberately onto the market to stabilize prices when harvests run high and withheld when they run low. Think about that for a second. Somewhere in Quebec, in unassuming industrial buildings, sits a stockpile of liquid gold managed with the same strategic logic nations apply to grain reserves or petroleum reserves, a hedge against nature's unpredictability, and a lever for controlling what the rest of the world pays for something as ordinary as pancake topping. The system works, from the producer's perspective, spectacularly well. It protects small-scale sugarbush operators from the boom and bust price collapses that plagued the industry for a century. And it gives Quebec extraordinary leverage in global negotiations. But cartels invite exactly the kind of temptation cartels always invite. And in 2011 and 2012, that temptation produced one of the strangest agricultural crimes in modern history. Investigators discovered that a significant portion of the strategic reserve, syrup worth around $18 million, had simply vanished from a warehouse in St. Louis de Blanford. Barrels believed full of syrup were found nearly empty, siphoned out and quietly replaced with water to preserve the weight and avoid immediate detection during casual inspection. The theft had been carried out patiently, over months, by people with inside access to the reserve, who trucked the stolen syrup across provincial and even national lines to sell it off the books to unsuspecting buyers. It took a routine inventory audit to expose the scale of what had happened, triggering a sprawling criminal investigation, arrests, and prison sentences for the ringleaders. The press, inevitably, could not resist the obvious framing, and headlines around the world ran some version of the same joke. Canada's most valuable heist wasn't gold. It was syrup. But underneath the punchline was something genuinely revealing about how far this commodity had traveled from its origins. A product once tapped by hand from individual trees in ritual secrecy, then boiled over open fires by colonial farmers, had become valuable enough, centralized enough, and strategically hoarded enough to be worth organized criminal theft on an international scale. The empire had grown so effective at protecting its liquid gold that it had inadvertently created the exact kind of high-value, tightly controlled stockpile that attracts thieves the way honey attracts bears. Quebec tightened security after the heist, treating its reserves with the same seriousness a central bank treats its vaults, because by then everyone involved understood the stakes. This was no longer breakfast condiment. This was strategic resource management for a global commodity that one province had, quietly, deliberately, and almost completely cornered. So think about that bottle sitting in your refrigerator door right now, sandwiched between the mustard and the expired salad dressing, costing you maybe $8 at the grocery store. It does not look like much. Amber liquid, a little sticky around the cap, a label with a cartoon leaf, or a folksy farmhouse scene, designed to make you think of hand-hewn buckets and gentle snowfall. That packaging is not lying to you, exactly, but it is only telling you a fraction of the story. Because what you are actually holding is the end point of a chain that stretches back roughly 10,000 years to indigenous nations who read the freeze-thaw cycle of the forest with an intimacy modern science is only now starting to appreciate, who treated the first run of sap as a sacred gift requiring ceremony and gratitude before a single tree was tapped. Somewhere in that chain, European settlers watched, learned, and then quietly rewrote the authorship of a technology they did not invent. Somewhere in that chain, abolitionists in wool coats stood in northeastern churches, insisting that a spoonful of maple sugar was a small act of moral defiance against a slave economy built on cane fields. Somewhere in that chain, con men in the 20th century thinned real syrup with corn syrup and food coloring and sold it to trusting families, until inspectors and grading systems had to be built specifically to catch them. And somewhere in that chain, one Canadian province built something that functions, in practice, like OPEC for pancakes, complete with quotas, a strategic reserve, and a heist dramatic enough to make international headlines. Ritual, appropriation, abolition, fraud, regulation, monopoly, all of it reduced down. Quite literally, the way sap itself is reduced down over heat until 40 gallons becomes 1. That is the actual ratio of history to the object in front of you. 40 gallons of complicated, contested, occasionally exploitative human behavior boiled down into a single, deceptively simple gallon of something sweet. The next time you pour syrup over a stack of pancakes on a Sunday morning, you are not just adding flavor, you are participating in the tail end of a 10,000-year-old supply chain that has survived colonization, war, fraud, and organized crime, and somehow still ended up looking completely unremarkable on a supermarket shelf. That, more than anything, might be the real trick of maple syrup. Not that it is sweet, not that it is rare, but that something this loaded with history has managed to disguise itself so completely as something ordinary. A tree bleeds once a year for about 6 weeks, and somehow that narrow biological window has been ritualized, colonized, weaponized, industrialized, and monopolized, and still shows up on your table looking like nothing more than breakfast. If you found that as strange and satisfying as we did, you know what to do. Subscribe, because history has a way of hiding in the most ordinary places, and we plan on finding all of them.